Yes, I said I was finished, but we know what that means. I wanted to talk to you about the Dallas Statement because a lot of times people don't understand the background of how a document like that is put together. And Larry Geraghty was on the scholarly committee that worked on the Dallas Statement. He was also at the General Conference. And his take on what happened with the Dallas Statement is therefore very important. But first of all, I wanted to talk to you about another church, the Calvinist churches, who very much these days depend on the Westminster Confession. Just to give you an idea that the Adventist Church is not the only church that has come up with a statement of faith. And after this has been done, people often use these statements as though they're as infallible as the Bible. They don't realise the history and how various groups within the church have very different opinions, and this affects the outcome of the statement. And there's always politics that go along with the theology of the statement. And I've written a little bit on the Westminster Confession. I'm not an expert in the time of Charles I and Oliver Cromwell. But there were great religious differences. The Calvinists wanted the government to be run on the basis of biblical principles. And the Anglican Church, as it came to be called later than the time I'm talking about, but the Church of England, was the King's Church. And the King was very much an autocrat in charge of the church. Of course, this began with Henry VIII, who used the Church of England politically to further his ends, in particular to get rid of his first wife and marry Anne Boleyn. And all of these things have to be taken into account. Oliver Cromwell, in the Calvinist church, there were two main groups. There'd always be more than two, but the main groups. Oliver Cromwell, who was became the head of the army, and then the head of the republic that ruled England for a period of years. And Oliver Cromwell, the one who called the regicide, called for the death and execution of Charles I. He was a Republican and a Congregationalist. So he was against the Presbyterianism, which had a series of elders like the Church of England and similar somewhat to the Roman Catholic Church, where there was order from the top. And the Congregationalists were a network of local churches where the local church had the power. So that was one of the big differences within Calvinism, the Presbyterians versus the Congregationalists. And Charles I, he was against the Westminster Confession, but an ordinance of the Parliament called an Assembly of Divines, which met at Westminster in 1643. And there were 5 previous attempts that failed. And he sent out a proclamation that forbade this meeting and threatened that he would proceed against those who attended with the utmost severity of the law. And because of this, the Church of England divines, the Anglicans, as they later came to be called, the Episcopalians, who'd been summoned to attend, never did. 150 people were called, including 10 lords, 20 commoners as lay assessors, and 120 clergy. And I'm not going to mention who was in that group, but about 25 didn't appear at the assembly because one or two had died, others were afraid of the displeasure of the king, or were happy with the way things were. Now, Presbyterians were the majority in the assembly, but the group was divided into factions that disagreed over church government. And these parties were, one, those Episcopalians, Church of England clergy, who believed in a moderate form of episcopacy, that is, a system of bishops. These were led by James Ussher, a fine scholar for his time. Now, he was a Calvinist, but he was also a chaplain of Charles I and a royalist, and he tended to conform to the Church of England. The second group was Presbyterians. They favoured a church-led government, and this position was pushed strongly by the Scottish commissioners, especially George Gillespie, Samuel Rutherford, and the most influential Englishman was Edward Reynolds, who later became a bishop in the Church of England, but previously had been a Calvinist. Third, Thomas Goodwin led the group of independents who favoured the congregation as the pivotal point of church polity. And the fourth were Erastians, and they believed that the state should determine church polity. It meant that the sins of Christians should be punished by the civil authority, not through the church. And there's a list of people who represented that group. But these groups were divided in opinion over the issue of how to govern the church, the forms of hierarchy, the relationship of church and state, issues about religious liberty, and the uniformity of the church's liturgy, or its method of conducting services, dress, furniture, and form of the services. So when the Scottish commissioners arrived, it looked as though the Church of England might adopt a Presbyterian system like the Scots. They'd been influenced by John Knox. But in February 1644, a group of 5 independents wrote an apologetical narration, and that brought a heated debate between the Presbyterians and the independents, mainly over the issue of predestination, that certain people who've been born are born to be saved, and certain people who've been born are born to die. A horrible doctrine. Different issues to the Adventist Church, but you see among these various groups great difference and battling among themselves, and completely different views, and very hard for them to get on with. So one of the differences between these groups was congregationalism versus hierarchalism. They were divided over the role of church and state. They were divided over issues of ecclesiology and worship and doctrine. So they did produce the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1649 and 2 catechisms, the larger and the shorter catechism, and the whole publication was called the Westminster Standards. Parliament eventually adopted a Presbyterian form of government, but had been watered down and lacked power. And then these documents were discarded when Charles I was restored to the throne in 1660. But the Church of Scotland and most Presbyterian denominations use them to this day. The Westminster Assembly was dissolved in 1649. The reason I mention this is we have a daughter, my stepdaughter, Elaine, who is currently studying to do a Master of Counselling at Westminster Theological Seminary, and in order for her to become a counsellor, at least in America, after doing the coursework and doing all the practicums that are required, that people who want to counsel and to get certified have to sign the Westminster Confession of Faith. But when you look back and you see how it was developed, you realise the problems with it. It's not a perfect document. It's hashed out by people of many different beliefs within a group, and it's never perfect. And it's a big mistake to use it like a creed. So that's my little take on the Westminster Confession of Faith, because we had a similar problem in Adventism when we brought in the 27 fundamentals at Dallas in March and April 1980. Now, here's an article by Lawrence Geraghty. I probably won't read you all of it, but I'll read some of it to show you the history of this statement. And I've mentioned before that the Dallas Statement was used to discipline Des officially. All the work that was done at Glacier View that ended up from the small groups and the large group and the writing up of the consensus statements, that wasn't considered to be our fundamental beliefs. That's said very clearly in the Ministry magazine. So according to the Ministry magazine, according to Elder Parmenter's letter that was given to Des, the Dallas Statement was the benchmark by which Des was judged. But I've also mentioned to you, probably too much, that a group of 6 from the people at Glacier View, including half of them, Dedran, Arthur Furch, Norm Young, would not have been able to sign that document themselves, because it was comparing Des's Glacier View manuscript, his 900-page document, with traditional Adventism. And that was what was used on the Friday afternoon to discipline Des. The Dallas Statement and the consensus statement weren't raised. So you see the absolute unfairness. And Neil Wilson asked Norman, he must have asked these 6 men, and there had to have been a deliberate act to do that, a very clever trick, to ask Des not to shelve his views, which Parmenter's letter almost says, that he had to put his views in abeyance. I can't remember the exact word, but to change his mind and say he'd been wrong, and he was given this 10-point statement, and this was what he had to change his mind about. So it's very dishonest. And there's plenty of documentary evidence, and I read you in my last video 2 letters, one by Larry Geraghty and one by Fred Veltman, and they saw this point exactly, that this 10-point statement was not voted on, it didn't reflect the whole group, a lot of people had already left. Anyway, we've been over that. Anyway, here we are, this is Larry Geraghty, and he's telling the history of this statement. Friday afternoon, April 25, 1980, this is from May, June, July. This is 4 months before Glacier View. And I've said elsewhere that this was devised in order to fire Des. And I don't have any actual evidence of that, but this was said. It may have even been implied by Neil Wilson in his introductory statement about the Dallas Statement. Friday afternoon, April the 25th, while the platform was literally being dismantled, behind the President of the General Conference presiding over the final business meeting of the 1980 session, the delegates voted to replace a 50-year-old document with a new statement of fundamental beliefs. None of the 27 beliefs were new, of course, but the restatement was. Apart from election of new conference and division officers, the adoption of the statement was the most significant event of the GC session. An account of the statement's formulation and acceptance from the perspective of a person who was privileged to be able to participate in drafting the document before and during the General Conference session may be helpful. This is Bonnie Dwyer introducing Larry. Although Uriah Smith's fundamental principles had appeared in various denominational publications after 1873, a request came to the General Conference in 1930 from Africa, asking for further clarification of Adventist fundamental beliefs. On December 29, 1930, the General Conference Committee voted that the Chair, C.H. Watson, the President of the General Conference, appoint a committee of which he shall be a member to prepare such a statement for publication in the yearbook. Watson appointed M.E. Kern, Associate Secretary of the General Conference, E.R. Palmer, General Manager of the Review and Herald Publishing Association, and F.M. Wilcox, Editor of the Review and Herald. Wilcox was assigned the task of drafting the statement. The 22 fundamental beliefs that the committee reported were never officially discussed, approved, voted, or formally adopted. According to Gottfried Oosterwal, their publication in the yearbook of 1931 and 2 years later in the Church Manual was a personal accomplishment of Elder Wilcox and his group of 4. Realising that the General Conference Committee or any other church body would never accept the document in the form in which it was written, directly to Edson Rogers, the General Conference statistician, who published it in the 1931 edition of the yearbook, where it has appeared ever since. It was without the official approval of the General Conference Committee, therefore, and without any formal denominational adoption, that Elder Wilcox's statement became the accepted declaration of our faith. At the 1946 GC session, it was voted that the statement of fundamental beliefs, as well as any other portion of the Church Manual, should be revised only at a General Conference session. The 1931 document, therefore, with minor revisions, continued to represent the fundamental statement of denominational belief. The 1931 statement was apparently designed to articulate the basic tenets of Adventism for non-Adventists. A strong motive for revising that statement was a desire for an official response to issues increasingly debated within Adventism. In the light of recent controversies, some particularly in the General Conference, felt the statement suffered from glaring omissions. Others, particularly Bernard Seaton, an Associate Secretary of the General Conference, persistently reminded his colleagues that the statement also had literary inadequacies. Finally, in late 1978, the officers of the General Conference appointed an ad hoc committee referred to as X 1535 Church Manual Revision, Fundamental Beliefs. And less than 2 years later, the Church would have a new statement of fundamental beliefs. The members of the ad hoc committee were all located at the General Conference headquarters in Washington, D.C., with W. Duncan Eva, a General Conference Vice President, as chairman. On August 10, 1979, Duncan Eva distributed the committee's preliminary draft to the General Conference officers, division presidents, and union presidents in North America. In an accompanying letter, Eva noted that formal and substantive changes in the 1931 statement had been made. Formally, the sequence of topics had been altered and paragraph headings had been inserted. Substantively, the sections on the Trinity had been expanded from 2 paragraphs to 4, concerning angels, creation and the fall, the church, unity in the body of Christ, the Lord's Supper, Christian marriage, and the Christian home and education. He also said that before the new statement would be submitted to the full Church Manual Committee, it would be presented to certain professors at the seminary with whom we will meet in September. After the Church Manual Committee gave its approval, the statement would proceed to the Home and Overseas Officers, the Union Presidents, the Annual Council, and finally to the General Conference session in Dallas. 2 weeks later, Andrews University President Joseph G. Smoot informed 9 members of the Seventh-day Adventist Seminary faculty and the university's Vice President for Academic Affairs that Elder Eva had requested a special meeting with them approximately a month later, September 19. It would precede a much larger meeting the next day, called by several General Conference officers to discuss with Science and Religion faculty of the university the often revised statements on creation and on revelation and inspiration. In general, the statement prepared by the ad hoc committee in Washington and sent to the seminary professors was a genuine improvement over the 1931 statement. This is by Larry Geraghty. Sorry, I didn't read the introduction. I did have some questions. For example, Christ was born of the Virgin Mary, Virgin with a capital, ? Or the book of Genesis contains the only inspired, reliable chronicle of the creation of the world. What's wrong with the account in Psalms? Obviously, the document's authors were more interested in the interpretation of Genesis than in the doctrine of creation. Indeed, the document as a whole was uneven in its organisation and style. It was obviously a patchwork job with mixed terminology, a lack of balance with regard to length of individual sections, differences in the way documentation was handled, and a general administrative concern with events and behaviour rather than meaning. For example, the Lord's Supper is customarily observed once each quarter of a year. Doesn't tell you what it's about. The educational system of the church is designed for partnership with the home for the salvation of the children. Says nothing real about our educational system. God's unchangeable law requires the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday, and so on. So, a further problem was procedural. The document came with a covering letter saying that at this stage, this document is confidential, intended only for those to whom it's sent. It may not be copied or duplicated in any way. At first blush, it seemed to be a secret committee hoping to railroad through its statement. After that, the rank and file could decide whether or not they wanted to be Seventh-day Adventists. Although it became apparent as we worked with the brethren from Washington, D.C., that this was not their intent, and although I was pleased to be among a group of seminary teachers with whom the General Conference leaders consulted, I could not help but think of my colleagues in institutions around the world who are just as qualified, just as interested, and had just as large a stake in the church as I did. Why didn't the General Conference set up a representative commission to handle the revisions, one to which any interested church member could have access, and one which would be given time to do the job right? But I was not in a position to make the rules, so I decided to express my concerns while working for a better document in any way I could. The first opportunity I had to express my views was at a meeting of the committee, often, in quote marks, called by Smoot September 12 to give a preliminary review of the statement. It was evident there that many of my colleagues shared my concerns. We had recommended that our review committee be enlarged to include those who had special expertise in the creeds of the Church. 2, that the statement be completely rewritten to avoid the weaknesses exhibited by the attempt to stay with the wording and order of the 1931 statement. And that 3, the result of our effort, if acceptable to Washington, D.C., be published in the Adventist Review with the invitation for comment and reaction by any concerned. Fritz Guy, Professor of Theology, and Kenneth Strand, Professor of Church History, both on the seminary faculty, were added to our review committee. Our new committee of 12 divided up the paragraphs of the statement of fundamental beliefs for individual reworking with Thomas Blincoe, Dean of the Seminary, Ivan Blazon, Professor of New Testament, Fritz Guy, Professor of Theology, William Johnson, Professor of New Testament and Associate Dean of the Seminary, William Shea, Professor of Old Testament, and Lawrence Geraghty, getting the heaviest assignments. Within 6 days, we again came together to hammer out a consensus, paragraph by paragraph, on the document as a whole. We worked late into the night of September the 18th in an attempt to be ready for the next day's meeting with the brethren from Washington, D.C. By 4 p.m. the next day, the essential structure of the document as it now stands and most of the wording were ready. Meeting with the Andrews Committee of 12 were Elders Duncan Eva, Chairman, Richard Hamill and Willis Hackett, all Vice Presidents of the General Conference. The latter invited Robert Brown and Harold Coffin from the Geoscience Research Institute to sit with us. As expected, they contributed especially to the paragraphs on Scripture, creation, and the great controversy, which mentions the flood. So, Larry's told us the history of how, there's the 1930 statement and it has been rewritten, but they've used the old language, so it's still got lots of problems and it's not very good as far as a literary document. So they call in the 12 scholars. They essentially rewrite it, send it back to GC. The leaders from Washington, D.C. were faced with a dilemma. Should they insist on sticking with the document they'd originally sent to the scholars in order to save face with the original ad hoc committee in Washington, or should they consider the completely rewritten document prepared by the Andrews Committee of 12? They agreed to at least take a look at the new document, and most of the vice presidents liked what they read. There was a lot of give and take, for the most part, in good spirit. At one point, in trying to arrive at consensus wording for Creation Week, Willis Hackett gave up with a comment, "Oh well, you can word it any way you want to here. We'll get another crack at it back in Washington." Understandably, the Andrews group felt it had been wasting its time if that was the way the game was going to be played. Each paragraph was modified and improved as a result of group discussion. The Andrews contingent felt that the statement of fundamental beliefs was where the action was, preferred to concentrate its time and energies there. But the General Conference representatives felt we should interrupt our work to discuss with a larger group of Andrews University faculty the creedal statements on creation, on revelation/inspiration, as scheduled. Having dutifully aired our views on these documents for the prescribed time in the larger meeting, the Committee of 12 returned to the more positive task of articulating our fundamental beliefs. By the time the General Conference Vice Presidents departed, most revisions had been made. So next week, we mailed off to Washington, D.C. our completed draft with the 27 paragraphs divided into 6 major sections: Revelation, God, Creation and Redemption, the community of faith, the Christian life, and the last things. Our colleagues who attended the Convocation on Righteousness by Faith in Washington, D.C. the first week in October delivered our last revisions to complete the job. Complete in the sense that it was the best we could do given the pressure of time and circumstances. To the extent the statement had literary form and beauty, the credit belonged to Fritz Guy, whose linguistic artistry and theological acumen were evident throughout. On October the 16th, 1979, the Annual Council adopted without changes and in principle the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs that had in the meantime been passed with only slight modifications by the General Conference Church Manual Committee. It was sent out to members of the division committees immediately, as well as to unions and overseas colleges. It was given to the Adventist Review for immediate publication in the hope that as many reactions as possible could be received from the field prior to the General Conference quinquennial session in Dallas. Unfortunately, for reasons never disclosed, it did not appear for 4 months, until February 21, 1980. As a result of the statement's distribution at Annual Council and publication in the Review, scores of letters came to Elder Eva, most appreciative and suggesting constructive changes. Being the kind of statesman he is, Eva decided the fairest thing to do would be to collate all the suggestions and discuss each one with the Andrews Committee of 12. He and Richard Lesher, director of the Biblical Research Institute, met with us most of the day on March 9 for that purpose. Many improvements were introduced into the statement as a result of these letters from church leaders and members around the world. The quality of many of the suggestions showed that if the statement had been published in the Adventist Review at an earlier date, the editing committee could have had at its disposal an even more representative sampling of opinion from the World Church that may have in turn allowed us to produce a document representing a truer consensus. Since the General Conference leaders had to return to Washington, D.C. that day, we were left on our own to tidy up the document. Fritz Guy typed most of the night to have it ready to put on the plane in the morning. By March 10, the revised version with 28 paragraphs, Lord's Supper and baptism were divided, was in Eva's hands. He called back to say the new paragraph on the sanctuary would not be acceptable. Therefore, Blincoe, Guy and Johnson redid it along the lines of the original September-October 1979 version. Eva felt he had to get some version out immediately to the delegates who would be coming to Dallas, so on March 11 he mailed to the delegates the document received from Andrews University the previous day, with the substitution of the September-October sanctuary paragraph accompanied by a covering letter. It indicated that before the General Conference session, the Church Manual Committee at the General Conference Office and the offices at Dallas prior to the session would review the statement before it reached the floor. As a delegate, I received my copy of Eva's March 11 letter on March 24. Obviously, many delegates may not have received their copies of the statement in advance of the session in Dallas, especially if they were from overseas and left home early to travel in the United States, as many did. In the meantime, Fritz Guy was called to Washington, D.C. to help evaluate further correspondence on the statement that had come in from the field and to meet with the Church Manual Committee when it considered the completed statement, On March 14, under the chairmanship of G. Ralph Thompson, the Church Manual Committee approved the proposed statement of fundamental beliefs that had been sent out to the delegates with only minor revisions. But more letters from the field continued to flood Eva's desk. For instance, one came from Fred Veltman, chairman of Pacific Union College's Religion Department. He was writing after his faculty had spent 2 department meetings going through the statement and planned at least one more. His letter of March 11 reflected the concerns of many thoughtful Adventists. It may be that when our church was small, it was possible to get an accurate representation from the world field if you mailed the recommended statement to the delegates at least 6 weeks before the session convenes. But it is doubtful whether these delegates have time to get their input from their local congregations prior to the session, given the size of the church today and the problem of getting reactions, and submitted such reactions back to headquarters in time to make any changes before the session is held. In order for delegates to function legitimately, they must not only be informed by the General Conference leadership on the issues which they will be asked to vote upon, but these same delegates need to be informed by the people they represent, so they will know how to perform as delegates in such a way as to honestly represent the field from which they came. Later, Veltman forwarded to Eva a series of recommendations for changes in the statement that had been unanimously approved by his departmental faculty. The work of the scholars at Pacific Union College was not in vain. Many of their suggestions were incorporated in the statement voted at Dallas. I believe that Des would have been on the faculty at PUC at that time. Those involved in the process of drafting the statement up to that point were under the definite impression that the version of the statement adopted by the Church Manual Committee would go before the delegates in Dallas 1 month later, but perhaps on the basis of letters to Washington received even later, further changes were made in Washington, D.C., without consulting the Committee of 12. At the first business session at Dallas, delegates expressed shock that the version of the statement to which they had prepared responses had been substantially changed. Therefore, they were now suddenly unprepared to discuss so crucial a document as the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs. Those who had been involved in formulating the earlier draft felt that the new version was disastrous in form, if not content. Gone was the balance, the beauty, and the sensitivity to words. Clumsy rhetoric prevailed. By the time the Home and Overseas officers had made additional changes during their April 14 meeting in Dallas, just prior to the opening of the General Conference session, 3 of the sections had been completely rewritten, one to more than twice its original length. 21 other paragraphs were significantly altered, either in meaning or style. For instance, the newer version referred to the scriptures as infallible. The paragraph on God was titled Godhead or Trinity. To the sensitive phrase that Christ perfectly exemplified the righteousness and love of God, the officers added, as our example. The sentence declaring that God has revealed in Scripture the only authentic account of his creative activity was changed to read, the Scriptures provide the only authoritative account of origins. The adjectives complete and perfect were omitted as descriptions of the atonement. The Lord's Supper was called this blessed ordinance instead of this experience of communion. Added were phrases saying that the writings of Ellen White are a continuing source of truth, and elsewhere that we are to take no part in sinful pleasures and follies. Many other significant changes had been made. By combining the paragraphs on spiritual gifts and the ministries of the Church, the total number of paragraphs within the statement was again reduced to 27. When the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs was brought to the floor for discussion in Dallas on April the 21st, Willis Hackett turned the chair over to Neil Wilson, who assured the delegates, "We are not suggesting changing any belief or doctrine that this church has held. We have no interest in tearing up any of the foundations of historical Adventism. This document is not designed to do that, nor to open the way that that can be done. It should be clear that we are not adding anything, or are we deleting anything in terms of historical Adventist theology. We are trying to express our beliefs in a way that will be understood today. So do you understand this? Neil Wilson's mind, this was just written in a way to express our original views better. He also made it clear that though he hoped to vote the document in Dallas, he was in no rush. The church was not adrift. We have a clear statement of fundamental beliefs. We will hold on it until together we decide to refine, reword, and restate it in today's language. To those who are afraid of a creed, Wilson said the Seventh-day Adventist Church does not have a creed as such. Nothing is set in concrete in terms of human words. The time never comes when any human document cannot be improved upon. In terms of procedure, the newly re-elected President of the General Conference asked the delegates to speak only to substantive theological content, allowing details in wording to be handled by a competent editorial committee of scholars and theologians. So we gain something by listening to this history, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because a lot of it's on minutiae after this. That in Neil Wilson's understanding, the Dallas Statement did not change our fundamental beliefs, the traditional views at all. It was just written in language that was more easily understood. Most of the business sessions the next week were taken up with paragraph by paragraph discussion of the proposed document. So I'm not going to read this, but some of the people who spoke were Russell Standish, Leroy Moore, Ariel Roth. These are all right-wing people who tend to be very literal, and so you expect that the changes that they wanted are towards the traditional view. Just a couple of things. Robert Spangler, the newly elected Secretary of the Ministerial Association, advocated strengthening the paragraph on the gift of prophecy by substituting "and for which" in the sentence that said, "Her writings are a continuing and authoritative source of truth, which provide for the Church comfort, guidance, instruction and correction." The delegates voted not to make the change, but the Adventist Review in its final printed version made the change. So again, we see what happens behind the scenes. And I'll just finish off with the last paragraphs. The part of the process that made me the most uncomfortable was the voting on the floor. Obviously, truth is not established by a majority vote. Our fundamental beliefs. Maybe, but consensus is far more difficult to achieve in theology than it is in policy. It's much more than a management problem. It takes accurate information and it takes time. I suspect that the process undertaken in Dallas was more helpful for those who participated in it than it was for the product. And as I reflect on the contents of the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs adopted in Dallas, I'm reasonably satisfied with the results given the circumstances, despite its obvious flaws, especially the extended particularity of some sections. It is certainly a more adequate document than the statement that represented Adventism for 50 years. What has allowed many who continue to see inadequacies in the statement To live with the document is its preamble, drafted and recommended by Ronald Graybill, Assistant Secretary of the White Estate. The wording as adopted reads, Seventh-day Adventists accept the Bible as their only creed and hold certain fundamental beliefs to be the teaching of the Holy Scriptures. These beliefs, as set forth here, constitute the Church's understanding and expression of the teaching of Scripture. Revision of these statements may be expected at a general conference session when the Church is led by the Holy Spirit to a fuller understanding of Bible truth, or finds better language in which to express the teaching of God's holy word. So again, you can find that on Spectrum in 1980. I believe it's been published, or you can find it on Google, put in Larry Geraghty, Dallas Statement of Faith, or 27 Fundamentals of Faith, and it probably will bring up the Spectrum source. Or put in Spectrum, SDA in Google, and you'll come up to the website and be able to search the archives. So what I've tried to do in this talk is to say that statements of faith are never perfect, because in reality, on the floor, you have always in churches, whatever the denomination, you have groups of people who have different ideas. And you have some who are more particularly correct and get listened to in the church, and churches often follow traditions. This is true of the Westminster Statement of Faith, which our daughter, if she wanted to work in the Presbyterian system, would have to sign to agree the Westminster Confession. She'd have great difficulties because she doesn't believe in predestination. She doesn't believe in the doctrine of hell. So this is the problem when it comes to using creeds. And the average person in the church thinks, well, the church put all this time into this and it was very straightforward. But you see what happened. Duncan Eva was in charge, wonderful man, a great friend of ours, a lover of the gospel, according to Bob Parr, fairly advanced, a real statesman, beloved by many people in the church because of his graciousness and diplomacy. And he brings this statement of faith to the scholars, and they rework it in a way that would be acceptable to the Christian world out there, that would be biblically based, and it goes back and people alter it, and then it goes to the floor and gets altered again. And a lot of the strength and beauty of it in the early days was lost. And again, the note that Neil Wilson states that it hasn't changed our fundamental beliefs. It has only expressed them in language that is more easily to understand. That was his take. And therefore, Glacier View was a charade, as I've said before. It cost a fortune. It cost a lot of money to bring in people from all over the world, scholars, administrators, to share their beliefs, to feel they were part of a just process, to feel they were advancing knowledge, and then to find, as we've read in the letters of Geraghty and Veltman and Bob Parr, and there were many others who wrote to the church and basically gave up when they saw the writing on the wall, that the administration are not interested in change. And because of this, it doesn't matter that somebody like Des was one of the best promoters of the gospel that the church ever had. The gospel wasn't precious enough to many of the people at the top to stop them putting him out. Tradition was more important than the Bible. Thank you very much.